Bon après-midi, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meaning and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us at MISC and McGill to recognize the significance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is known as MISC. It's the Centre for Canadian, Quebec and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. Notre institut soutient une approche multidisciplinaire de l'étude du Canada en réunissant des étudiants, des chercheurs et des praticiens afin de discuter de questions importantes concernant le passé, le présent et l'avenir du Canada. En plus de nos programmes universitaires, l'Institut organise également des événements publics tels que la conférence d'aujourd'hui, événements qui portent sur un large éventail de sujets importants pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. Vous pouvez en savoir plus sur notre travail en allant sur le site web de McGill, donc c'est mcgill.ca /MISC, M-I-S-C. Today we are pleased to welcome you to the 2025 Mallory Lecture. I would like to take a minute to thank the Mallory family, whose support enriches the study of Canada at McGill and makes possible these annual lectures. JR Mallalori was a professor of political science at McGill University. He was born in 1916 in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and he was educated at New Brunswick, Dalhousie, and Edinburgh. His career took him to Saskatchewan, Toronto, Brandon, and McGill, where he served for 45 years and was chair of the economics and political science departments for 10 years. That was before the departments separated and became distinct entities. After retiring in 1982, he was appointed professor emeritus and continued to teach for another 10 years. Professor Mallory passed away in 2003. The endowment for the JR Mallalori Lecture in Canadian Studies was established in January 1995. The lectures featured such renowned speakers as Bob Ray, Andrew Coyne, Alain Dubuc, Tom Kent, John Gomery, Andrew Cohen, and Elizabeth May, and many others. So I think it's a really impressive list of speakers. And today we have a very impressive speaker too, Chantal Hébert. And we are really happy to have her. She's actually my neighbor. No, that's true. That's true. We live one block apart, and sometimes I have the pleasure to encounter her on the sidewalk. This pleasure for me, I'm not sure for her, but that's another story. So she's a freelance political columnist whose work is featured in radio, television, and in print in both French and English. That includes a weekly participation on the political panel At Issue on the CBC's The National, as well as on Peter Mansbridge's Good Talk podcast on Sirius XM. Madame Hébert a débuté sa carrière à Toronto en 1975 comme journaliste à la salle de nouvelles régionale de Radio-Canada avant de rejoindre la colline parlementaire pour la radio de Radio-Canada. Elle a été chef de bureau parlementaire du Devoir et de la Presse avant de devenir chroniqueuse politique au Toronto Star. Madame Hébert est diplômée au Collège Glendon de l'Université York. Elle est également Senior Fellow au Collège Massey de l'Université de Toronto et titulaire de doctorat honorifique d'une douzaine d'universités canadiennes. Hein? Oui, absolument. In 2012, she was appointed to the Order of Canada. Her second book, The Morning After, dealing with the 1995 referendum, the topic of our talk today, was published simultaneously in both official languages in 2015. In 2019, her peers in the Parliamentary Press Gallery awarded her the Charles Lynch Award for her long-standing coverage of national issues. In 2024, she received the Michener Baxter Award for Excellence in Journalism. Cette année, elle est devenue membre de l'Ordre national du Québec. Donc, plein de médailles, de récompenses, et c'est tout à fait mérité. Chantal Hébert, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. C'est à vous.
Yes, that's how he got me here. Hi, it's your neighbor, you know, bad things could happen to your property. And yeah, about those Order of Canada, Order of Quebec, I decided a long time ago that it was not proper for a working journalist to walk around with pins. And when the Order of Quebec came, I was thankful for having taken that decision, because am I supposed to wear both? Am I supposed to make a choice? If I make a choice, you know what's going to happen. So I keep it for the very, very many occasions when I go to big social dinners. That would be about once every 2 years. But, and I'll figure out what to do about the two of them when that comes up. Programming note, I'm going to be speaking because I'm not very good at switching back and forth between French and English. My brain doesn't work that way, so I'm going to speak English. But I will do a Q&A, and if you ask questions in French, I will answer in French. And if you choose the other language, you know what's going to happen. I usually say that in French, and only Francophones laugh because the others don't know what I'm saying, which allows me to say that's the price you pay for not being bilingual. It always works. So, couple of things about this book, The Morning After, which and this entire referendum story, which I landed in by accident because at the end of a replacement for someone on maternity leave on Parliament Hill, I was about to go back to my job as a national radio reporter to Toronto. And one of my colleagues said, "You've never gone to Meech Lake," which is where the Prime Minister then held a lot of meetings. I said, "No," I said, "the weather's nice, why don't you come along? You're going to get to see the place." So I tagged along for this meeting that was not supposed to result into much of anything. I had covered Queen's Park for a number of years, and it so happened that I had really solid connections to the Premier's office and to the people who worked for David Peterson. And during a washroom break, someone from David Peterson's office said, "You know what, there's going to be a deal here today." Now that went totally against conventional wisdom. I could hear my colleagues from CKAC preparing their radio stories behind me in the press room, saying, you know, "We've wasted a day here, and the Quebec budget is leaked, and it's a total failure." And I'm telling my colleagues, remember, I'm the one who's just temping for maternity leave purposes. I am not on the staff of that bureau. I tell them there's going to be a deal here. And they look at me and they say, "You do know that if you're wrong, that's the end of your career." So I went back to my source and I said, "Are you sure of what you..." And he looks at me and he says, why would I make this up?" So I write the story. I'm new to Parliament Hill in all ways. And Mike Duffy is a big deal at the CBC. He's also with Meech Lake that day. And the National goes on before, earlier in the evening, around 9 o'clock, and Mike Duffy has this story on the National where a total failure, everyone is going home, nothing happened. My colleagues are all looking at me thinking, At Radio-Canada radio in those days, our major newscast after 5 o'clock was at 10 o'clock. And it wasn't yet 10 o'clock, plus there was a hockey game on. So I said, how about, before we deny our own story, how about we wait until the 10 o'clock newscast? There's no rush because we can't get a report on the newscast until 10 o'clock. They're all short. So let's just ignore this until we really have to, and I'll do it. And then we're called to a press conference. I remember telling the colleague next to me, "So where's Mike Duffy now?" But I learned a lesson that I had kind of sensed when I was first sent to Ottawa to cover, as someone who didn't know what she was doing, to cover Bill Davis as part of the Patriation Talk, which is that those big people on Parliament Hill who think they know everything because they've got so great connections. It doesn't really matter. You can just do what you do. That now applies to me. So the other thing I wanted to tell you about the book is when I suggested in 2012 that I I had a contract with an English language publisher. And they had first rights, so I suggested that I do a story about the 1995 referendum, and that my plan was to go around to everyone who was important in a elected political position. I would ask them, so what happened? How did you see what would happen if the yes had won? Because in that last week, that was a distinct possibility. You had to have thought about it. And no one has ever asked them. And the answer was nobody wants to hear about the Quebec referendum. So that's 2012. So I said, well, that's fine, because I want you to, in writing, decline, and I'm going to go sell this in French. No problem. So they backed off. We did the book in 2014, and I'm happy to say that it really sold well in both official languages. So people didn't care, and it got me one of the greater moments of my life. Which is unrelated to politics. You know, when you write a book, you're invited to these many in this room with no politics and the pen dinner and stuff. It doesn't last for long, but you get a few free meals. And so I'm in Toronto for this dinner, and they've put 2 authors at every table. Now, me, I don't think of myself as an author. Few journalists who write books see themselves as authors. But I am someone, everyone who knows me will know, I read more fiction than nonfiction. I'm a big fiction person. And so I look at the card that says, you know, 2 authors, and I see my name, and I think, that's weird, me, author. And then I look at the other name, and it says John Irving. Oh boy, fan moment that I will never forget. I thought, I am sitting at the same table as the guy who wrote the Cider House Rules and all those books that I've actually read, and we're supposed to be the 2 authors at this table. It was an interesting evening. But to be truthful, why the book in 2012 and not in 1996, 97, 98? Because on the morning after the last referendum and in the year that followed, nobody wanted to talk. Nobody wanted to talk because once the votes were counted, there was one question on everyone's mind on the morning after, and the question was, did no mean no? And it was a fair question, because a week before the vote, polls showed that the yes had the wind in its sails, and it was going to win maybe with as much as 55% of the vote. Some would like to believe it shifted because of Jean Chrétien's deathbed televised address. I really don't think that it worked in that way, except in making a lot of Quebecers who were still angry at Jean Chrétien for his role in the Meech Lake saga feel happy to watch him cringe on TV. But the arguments, I don't think, carried the day. And his audience back then, for those of you who were around, did not come close to that of Lucien Bouchard, the leading figure on the other side. Others would like, and I wish I could pretend that that is true, that the so-called Lavin that brought thousands of well-meaning, misguided, mostly non-bilingual Canadians from outside the province to demonstrate their sudden love for Quebec made a difference. Having been around, I'm happy that nothing bad happened that day, but otherwise, I think the No Committee was kind of happy when everyone got back on planes, buses, and went home. And they were well-meaning. That wasn't the problem, but it was just not, it was kind of a picture-perfect moment of 2 solitudes. We're not even talking about the same thing. You think someone who is voting for the yes looks like, I don't know, some maniac from a movie in the 1970s. That person would be my neighbor who doesn't look like that at all. I think that if that significant enough number of people who switched in that last week switched, it's because of the positive polls that were published a week before. And I remember one night during the campaign, after we'd finished filing, doing whatever we're supposed to do, we were in a place where alcohol, as you may guess, and food ran freely, and someone from the No Committee walked in the same restaurant and came at us, accused us of hiding the polls that showed the yes to be ahead, which we weren't. What people don't know is those polls, they don't give them to the journalist in the newsroom. That's decided somewhere else. But in any event, I think a lot of Quebecers wanted to send a message to the rest of Canada on the heels of a fairly stormy constitutional period, and all of the things that were said about what distinct society meant over the course of the Meech Lake debate. I was in Manitoba in the spring of 1990 with the Charest Parliamentary Committee. When Le Club des Belles Fermières, I'm not too sure what they're called in English because I've tried to forget them, but anyways, that organization came and explained to Jean Charest and a number of other people, André Ouellette, mostly francophones on the committee, that the Distinct Society Clause would allow the Quebec government to lock women up in their homes so that they could have more kids. I didn't smoke back then, but I went out for a smoke. I pretended that I was going out for a smoke. I met people who did go out for a smoke for the same reason. It's either you stay in and it's going to show, or you take a deep breath, you go outside. I have friends that I met outside that day that are still friends to this day. My friend Jean Lapierre drove back to Ottawa after the referendum night, and he stopped at the gas station to tank up on the Quebec side of before you hit the 417. And the guy, and back in those days, there were people who actually put gas in cars, in some places at least. So, and no one really wanted to talk too much about the night before on the day after, but still, the guy at the pump, so Lapierre, said, so, you know, how was last evening? What do you think? And the guy said, I am thrilled by the result. And Jean said, so you voted no? Oh, he said, no, I voted yes. And I think that kind of captured totally this. Someone came to me in a restaurant about a week after the referendum, and he said, you have made me so happy with the coverage of the referendum. I feel so good about the result. He'd voted yes too. He wanted to get that on the record. But I think 30 years later, we can answer the question, did no mean no? Because back then, 96, 97, the real issue was Lucien Bouchard becomes premier. This group of voters that I've described, what's going to stop them from changing their minds? Over the course of that first year, Jean Chrétien is still the prime minister. It's not necessarily rosy on Parliament Hill, and Lucien Bouchard has his hands on the wheel. And here we are. So I've done the math because at some point I get tired of looking just at the referendum, Meech, etc. And Quebecers, since that night in 1995, have had 18 opportunities to use the ballot box to rekindle the sovereignty debate. 18 opportunities, that breaks down into 10 federal elections and 8 Quebec elections. In every single one of those elections, the sovereignty issue was on the ballot, and in the case of the Quebec elections, it was totally possible to give a mandate to revisit the issue. That's more than enough usually to see a pattern. I'm not going to live to 100 to wait to see a pattern because I'm not going to make it. And if you were to connect the dots between all those votes, what you find is that over the past 3 decades, Quebec voters have gone out of their way to avoid revisiting the issue and to explore other options. At the federal level, that's been mostly striking, despite the fact that the Bloc Québécois was on the ballot for all that time, and for most of that period led by competent people. 25% of voters in 2006 voted for the Conservative Party, led by Stephen Harper, a former Canadian Reform Party person who advocated partition, and they lead up and right after the referendum. Those voters were massively francophones, and to this day, they still vote for the Conservative Party, which means the Conservative Party has managed to hang on to a bit of a beach in Quebec, in francophone Quebec. We could talk about the Orange Wave, which was really striking, bringing the NDP from nowhere to sweeping the province. And I am not a Quebecer. I was raised in Ontario. I've gone to those bio notes that go on forever, kind of tell you that if I went to York University, it wasn't out of a spirit of adventure. It was because Toronto was where I lived. But I have to say that I had never seen that phenomenon of this transmission of a decision between Quebecers that takes place over the course of a 37-day campaign. Like, how would people who live on the Magdalen Islands, very far from Le Plateau, know to vote for the NDP? What mechanism brings that phenomenon about? There's ways to talk about Jack Layton's campaign, etc., but seriously, it wasn't a bad campaign, but it wasn't, Mr. Kennedy was not resuscitated by Jack Layton. It was a good campaign, but I would look at, for the weeks after that Orange Wave, I would look at when the geese go south, and I would think they know how to do this. And for some reason, Quebecers have this political kind of boussole that leads them to do these things once in a while. And it's quite something to watch, because if you look at the Orange Wave, it wasn't there when the campaign started. And that is why, word of advice, never ever call a Quebec election on the day of the call, because campaigns do matter in this province. And more recently, talking about diversification, 43% of Quebec voters supported Mark Carney's Liberal Party. They did that despite the fact that he was the least bilingual of the main candidates on offer. It's a distinction he continues to hold. But I think the NDP is about to take that title away, much to the Liberals' relief, but it's still, when the campaign started, you know how many pundits said, but the French, and you know what would happen? We would get emails and texts from voters that would say, will you please leave this man alone with his French? So what Quebecers want, it is what they do. And should I add 3 consecutive Quebec victories for Justin Trudeau, whose last name is not necessarily a great calling card for many Francophone voters. 3, and in all 3 cases, Trudeau won Quebec. He ended up with the most seats, but I thought, and I think everyone who writes history, which is not me, I live in the day, the most interesting vote clearly was the one that took place federally in 2000, when Jean Chrétien campaigned in Quebec on the heels of the Clarity Act, and when Quebec's political class, for the most part, federalist and sovereigntist, agreed that it was a glaring intrusion in Quebec's affairs. Trudeau walked away from that election with 44% of the vote. It was his best score in Quebec ever. And Lucien Bouchard resigned. But then you look at the provincial seat, because after all, if we're going to stay in Canada, it's okay to explore options. Even if you vote for the Bloc Québécois, it's not going to get you a referendum. To do that, you need to go and elect a government that wants to do it provincially. So what this shows, well, I guess the Coalition Avenir Québec is the most striking example of the diversification that took place since the last referendum. But Québec Solidaire on the left, Éric Duhaime's Conservative Party on the right, they're also, in a smaller way, kind of products of the trend to break out of the federalist sovereigntist box. That basically is what they offer. Yes, Québec Solidaire says it's a sovereigntist party. Most of the people who vote for Québec Solidaire discount that and vote for it, despite the fact that they're federalist. It's kind of a non-issue, and well, the Coalition Avenir Québec is what it is, a coalition of people, a coalition of people who voted yes and voted no, and those who voted no have not changed their minds. I'm not sure those who voted yes have changed their minds either. So it's kind of a place that was created for people to be able to do something other than plan a referendum or stop a referendum, and it has worked until it won't work. The Parti québécois has only won 2 elections since 1995. In each case, the election poured cold water on any hopes of having another referendum. And here, again, this capacity to split in the ballot box, which is impossible to calculate. In 1998, Lucien Bouchard, who was the more competent person on the ballot, won the election in a majority government, but Jean Charest won the popular vote. And then you go, I don't think we're going to do this referendum thing, which I think Lucien Bouchard knew he wasn't doing again. And then in 2014, Pauline Marois starts the campaign. She's got every opportunity to convert a minority government into a majority government. Why else would she call an election? And then she goes to, I think, Saint-Jérôme, where Pierre Cal-Pelado goes, yeah, le Québec aux Québécois. And you look at the trend in the polls. 2 things happen when Mr. Pelado does this. A lot of sovereigntists get really excited, and a lot of other voters notice. And hence, at the end of the campaign, Madame Marois is not in government anymore. So having said all that, and I do want to leave a lot of time for questions, which is why I'm throwing all these things at you so that you can object. The next Quebec campaign is going to feature a referendum commitment, a real one, apparently, for the first time since Jacques Parizeau was elected in 1994. Now, there are 2 visions of history about the sovereignty project in Quebec and Quebecers' attitude to it. There's the one that I think is grounded in real life, and there's the one that is grounded in wishful thinking. In the wishful thinking version, we have been walking onward towards sovereignty since 1980, and 3 times lucky. In the world that I've lived in, we only had a referendum in 1995 because the rest of Canada really created the conditions for it during the Meech Lake debate. And absent that, which gave it the issue new momentum, I think back after Meech failed, I think a lot of Quebecers felt like today's doctors in Quebec. So insulted that they thought, I'm not allowing people to do this to me. And if a vote had taken place in the year after Meech failed, probably the result would have been different from what it was in 1995 when things had started to cool. But when you look at this, even not looking at all those campaigns I talked about, seriously, the better team in 1995 was the Yes team. The No team was led by Daniel Johnson, who is a very nice man, but charisma went somewhere else. And Jean Chrétien was kept away because he was, I went one evening during the campaign, early on in the campaign, just before Jacques Parizeau got off the bus and gave the bus to Lucien Bouchard. We went in Saint-Maurice to obviously he was going to speak in Saint-Maurice, his writing. And I always stand at the back of rooms, and it doesn't work as well these days, but for a long, long time, people didn't really notice me. I dress so flashily. So they talk around me, and I heard those 3 men from the writing. Obviously, they'd come because they were Federalists, and one was telling the other, that guy talking about Chrétien, he worries me. And I thought, this is weird, because in theory, at this point, the no is comfortably ahead, and it's all going to end well for them. But these people, just by instinct, they were just thinking, something is going to go wrong, and they were totally right about the something is going to go wrong. It did go wrong. So given that the PQ has a lead in the poll, and it wants to talk about a referendum, that is going to be part of the election conversation. I am not sure that's good news for the PQ. I look at the polls, 60% would be inclined to vote no. 1 in 4 PQ supporter wants to vote no. 2/3 of voters don't want to be asked again. And when I see polls about, you know, they come and go more, well, the older fringe is less sovereigntist because many people have died. That's what happens to baby boomers. I can say that. The younger people suddenly like sovereignty better, and I always think the only real question that matters is, do you want to be asked? Because if you like to tell a pollster that would be fun to do, but you don't want to be asked, then you're not going to be saying yes. The context has changed. It's not just that the spring that led to 1995 is no longer there. Some mornings when I open my social media feed to see what the guy there down south did overnight, I crave the days, return to the days when our biggest problem was to debate the Tripoli Senate and the Distinct Society Clause, and how much consultation we will have. Think of this. This is the Meech Lake Accord. How much consultation we will have between premiers and the Prime Minister to appoint senators and Supreme Court justices. We actually went to war over this stuff. Wow. But it was within our control to resolve it. Now we are somewhere else, and a referendum would take place in that somewhere else, where you can't say, well, of course we're going to keep CUSMA, which used to be we're going to stay in NAFTA, because 1, we don't know that CUSMA will be around, and 2, who knows what it would look like. There's also the fact that Scotland held a referendum on independence since 1995, and it was a really interesting process in the sense that the Parliament in Westminster agreed to recognize the result, but in exchange, the Parliament in Westminster also approved the question. There has never been a question put to Quebecers that would be the hard question. Do you want Quebec to become a country? I mean, I'm not going to reread the referendum question from 1995 because there are young people here and they would need to Google sections of it to figure out what it is talking about. That's how bad it is. And me, I know what it means because I was there, but it's 5 or 6 lines long and it refers to this and that. And then you think, really? So I don't think a question like that would ever be considered as an acceptable basis. I suspect that there would be an insistence on the Parliament of Canada to actually want to have a say on the question. So not obvious. Plus, at this point, maybe the Prime Minister would rather not campaign, given unless he wants to do French a bit more. But otherwise, he could say, this is not an exercise that I recognize, so. But I don't think we are going there in the sense that it is, and that's basically where I end on this, it's risky to confuse the cyclical thirst for change in government with support for a concept or a political personality. And if you do not believe me, you can ask Mr. Poilievre, which is why I'm not going to tell you how the next Quebec election will play out, because I don't believe that the dynamics of that campaign are available for any analyst to look at this point. I don't even know who's going to lead the Coalition Avenir Québec. I don't notice. I talk to a lot of people because they talk to me now on the buses and everywhere, and they never talk to me about a referendum. And in 1990, 93, 94, 95, anyone who lived in Montreal remembers that this was a big, big topic of conversation. They always talk to me about the same thing. It starts with a T. To the point where I noticed last summer, I spent about a month. I left the country for a while, but I spent a month where I was mostly in Montreal or in Quebec. And people would talk to me about politics because that's what they do. They talk to me a lot more because they come to me. So I'm not asking them anything. It's a very interesting process. But I noticed it's been 4 or 5 weeks here, and people have spoken to me about politics every day. And not a single one of them has used the name Marc Carney, Pierre Poilievre, Jean-Yves-François Blanchet. They talked to me, and it was the same the year before in the months before the US election. The only thing they would talk about was Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We all became such experts to the point where it's now become kind of the topic that people focus on. So it's quite something to be in Quebec and realize that for 4 weeks, no one has talked to you about a single Canadian or Quebec politician. And it's from people who actually talk about politics to you. So I have a hard time, I don't know, I mean, I guess there are academics here, you're bound to want to be engaged in the debate over the Quebec Constitution. I'm taking a pass. It's, well, when I was a kid, I would go to, like most little girls back then, we would fake that we were adults, and we would serve tea, we would have a little table, and I think there are others who have had that experience. To me, the Quebec Constitution debate at this point is a bit like that. And I'm too old for that, so I take a pass. And I'm going to stop now and open the floor to whatever questions. Merci.